My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I'm 31 years old. 6 months ago, my billionaire father stood at the head of a glass conference table on the 42nd floor of Caldwell Holdings and said a sentence that erased 14 years of my life in less than 10 seconds. Ethan will no longer have any role in this company.
No explanation.
No vote. Just a decision delivered in the same calm voice he used when approving a $300 million acquisition. Around the table sat 12 board members, 2 outside investors, and my younger brother Lucas, who was smiling like he'd just been handed the keys to the kingdom. I remember the exact time on the digital clock on the wall behind him. 10:14 a.m. October 3rd. I also remember the sound my chair made when I stood up. It was the only noise in the room. 14 years of working 60-hour weeks. 14 years of studying every contract, every zoning law, every financing structure that built my father's real estate empire into a company valued at $2.4 billion. And in 10 seconds, I was gone. But here's the part my father didn't know when he dismissed me in front of that boardroom. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning at exactly 2:17 a.m., my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. The same man who hadn't spoken to me since that meeting. The same man who told the board I was not leadership material. And when I answered, the first thing he said was something I never imagined hearing from Richard Caldwell. "Ethan, I need your signature." Before I tell you what happened next, take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if stories like this resonate with you. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because what happened in that boardroom wasn't really about that one meeting. It was the final move in a system my family had built over decades. In the Caldwell family, there were always 2 categories of children, the heir and the one who worked. Lucas was the heir. I was the one who worked. When Lucas turned 18, my father handed him the keys to a brand new Porsche 911 parked in the circular driveway of our Connecticut house. A place with 12 bedrooms, a tennis court, and a wine cellar bigger than most restaurants. When I turned 18, my father handed me a used Ford sedan that had previously belonged to one of the company's project managers. Lucas went to Harvard Business School. Tuition, housing, travel, everything paid for. The total bill was just under $320,000. I went to the University of Michigan on a scholarship and worked nights in the campus library to cover the rest. When Lucas graduated at 24, he walked directly into Caldwell Holdings as Vice President of Strategic Development. Corner office. 6-figure salary. Company equity. When I joined the company at the same age, my job title was Junior Financial Analyst. My office was a converted storage room next to the copy machine. My starting salary was $48,000 a year. But here's the thing. I never complained. Because while Lucas was busy learning how to network at private golf clubs and charity galas, I was learning how the company actually worked. I learned which contractors could finish a project under budget. I learned how lenders structured billion-dollar credit lines. I learned how to read a 100-page development contract and see the 3 sentences that actually mattered. By the time I turned 30, I had quietly worked on more than $900 million in property deals for Caldwell Holdings. Most of them closed successfully. My father rarely mentioned that part when introducing me to people. Instead, he would say things like, "Ethan prefers the back office work." It sounded polite. What it really meant was that in my father's version of the future, I wasn't meant to run anything. There was only one person he ever imagined sitting in his chair at the head of that glass conference table. Lucas Caldwell. And for a long time, I accepted that role. The quiet son. The reliable one. The person who made sure the numbers worked while someone else took the credit. But there was one person in our family who never saw things that way. My grandfather, Thomas Caldwell. He founded Caldwell Holdings in 1968 with a single office above a hardware store in Newark, New Jersey. By the time I was born, the company owned commercial properties across 5 states. My father inherited the business when my grandfather retired, but my grandfather never stopped watching. Every Sunday afternoon when I was growing up, I would visit him at his apartment on the Upper East Side. We'd sit at a small wooden table covered with old development blueprints and property maps. He didn't teach me like a professor. He told stories. Stories about deals that almost collapsed, about partners who walked away, about the difference between someone who built something and someone who simply inherited it. One afternoon when I was 27, he handed me a sealed brown envelope. It was thick, heavy enough that I could feel paperwork inside. I asked him what it was. He just smiled and said something that didn't make sense at the time. Every company has a moment when the truth about its leadership becomes impossible to ignore. He slid the envelope across the table toward me. When that moment comes, you'll know what to do with this. I took it home and placed it in the back of my closet. For years, I never opened it, because I assumed the moment he was talking about would never come. Then came October 3rd, the boardroom, my father's announcement, and the quiet realization, as I walked out of Caldwell Holdings carrying a cardboard box with my name printed on it, that the moment my grandfather warned me about had finally arrived. I did not drive home after leaving the Caldwell Holdings tower that morning. Instead, I sat in my car in the underground parking garage for almost 40 minutes, watching the elevator doors open and close while employees came and went carrying laptops and coffee cups like it was any normal Tuesday. My security badge had already been deactivated. I knew that because when I tried it on the garage exit gate, the screen flashed red and the barrier stayed down until the guard waved me through manually. That was the first time it felt real. 14 years inside that building, and suddenly, I was just another person driving away. The strange thing was that the meeting itself had not surprised me as much as it probably should have. The signs had been there for years. They were subtle if you did not look closely, but once you noticed them, you could not unsee them. Lucas was always positioned at the center of every announcement. When Caldwell Holdings opened our Chicago development office in 2019, the press release quoted my father and Lucas. I had structured the financing package for the entire project, a deal worth $270 million, but my name never appeared in the article. At the time, I told myself it did not matter. Titles and publicity were not the real work. Results were. But moments like that kept repeating. When we acquired a logistics park outside Dallas in 2021, Lucas gave the investor presentation, even though I had built the financial model that convinced the lenders to approve the project. When a national business magazine published a feature story about Caldwell Holdings the following year, the photo spread showed my father and Lucas walking through a construction site wearing white hard hats and tailored suits. I was standing 10 feet behind the photographer, holding a stack of contract documents that nobody ever saw. It was never openly hostile. That is the tricky part about these dynamics inside families that run companies. The imbalance hides behind polite language. My father would say things like, "Ethan prefers the analytical side of the business, while Lucas is more of a natural leader." Investors nodded because that explanation fit the narrative they expected. A charismatic heir and a quiet operations specialist. Nobody asked who was actually solving the problems that kept deals from collapsing. The clearest example happened 3 years before the boardroom meeting that ended my career at Caldwell Holdings. The company had negotiated a massive redevelopment project in downtown Baltimore. It was a mixed-use complex with 3 residential towers, 2 office buildings, and a retail promenade along the harbor. Total estimated cost was $1.1 billion. The lenders required a complicated financing structure that included 4 banks, a pension fund from Toronto, and a municipal tax incentive package that depended on strict construction timelines. I spent 9 months building the structure for that deal. I lived inside spreadsheets and legal documents until 2 in the morning most nights. By the time the closing date arrived, every line item had been reviewed at least 5 times. The morning of the final presentation to the board, I walked into the conference room with a binder that weighed almost 4 pounds. Lucas was already there wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My father stood near the window speaking with 2 outside directors. When he saw me, he nodded once and said, "Good work pulling the numbers together." Then he turned to Lucas and said, "You are ready to walk them through the strategy." I remember pausing for a moment because I thought I had misunderstood. But Lucas simply took the binder from my hands and carried it to the front of the room. For the next 40 minutes, he explained the deal I had designed while I sat quietly at the end of the table answering occasional technical questions. When the board voted to approve the project, the chairman congratulated Lucas for his leadership. Everyone applauded. My father shook Lucas's hand and said, "This is exactly the kind of initiative the company needs from its next generation." That phrase stayed with me. Next generation. Not next generations. Just one. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my office and updated the financing schedule so construction could begin the following week. That was how things worked inside Caldwell Holdings. Lucas delivered the speeches. I made sure the numbers behind those speeches actually functioned in the real world. For years, I convinced myself that this arrangement was temporary. My father was building Lucas's confidence while I learned the deeper mechanics of the company. Eventually, there would be space for both of us in leadership. That belief lasted until the summer before the boardroom meeting. We were hosting an investor dinner at a private club in Manhattan overlooking Central Park. About 30 people attended, including several representatives from a major private equity firm that had been discussing a potential partnership with Caldwell Holdings. During dessert, one of the investors asked my father a question that changed everything. He asked what the long-term leadership structure of the company would look like once my father retired. My father did not hesitate even for a second. He raised his glass slightly toward Lucas and said, "Lucas will take the company forward. He has the vision to lead Caldwell Holdings into its next phase of growth." The table nodded approvingly. Someone asked whether Lucas planned to expand the company internationally. Lucas launched into a confident answer about global markets and strategic opportunities. Nobody at the table looked in my direction. I was sitting 2 chairs away from my father, close enough to hear the ice cubes in his drink shift against the glass. That was the moment I understood something important. In my father's mind, the future of Caldwell Holdings had already been decided. I was not part of it. What I did not understand yet was how quickly that decision would turn into action, or how the envelope my grandfather gave me years earlier would suddenly become the most important document in the entire company. The night after the investor dinner in Manhattan, I could not sleep. I kept replaying my father's words in my head, the calm certainty in his voice when he said Lucas would lead the company forward. Not might. Not eventually.
Would.
It was the kind of statement that sounds simple to everyone else in the room, but when you are part of the family behind it, you understand how much had already been decided before the sentence was ever spoken out loud. I got home to my apartment in Brooklyn just after 11:30 that night. It was a 2-bedroom place in a building that overlooked the East River. Nothing extravagant, but quiet and close enough to Midtown that I could reach the office in 20 minutes if traffic cooperated. I loosened my tie, poured a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the skyline outside the window. For years I had accepted the idea that I was simply the quieter Caldwell, the one who handled numbers instead of speeches. But something about that dinner changed the way the pattern looked in my mind. Because once you finally see a system clearly, you start noticing the smaller details that support it. Lucas had always been introduced as the future of Caldwell Holdings. At charity galas, my father would place a hand on Lucas's shoulder and say, "This is the man who will run the company one day." When he introduced me, the sentence usually sounded different. "This is my son Ethan. He works on the financial side." It was subtle, but the hierarchy was always there. The next morning I arrived at the office at 7:30, earlier than usual. The cleaning crew was still finishing their rounds on the executive floor. The glass conference rooms were empty, the long corridor quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. I unlocked my office and opened the Baltimore project model on my computer, reviewing a few numbers that were scheduled for discussion later that week. Work had always been the one place where things made sense to me. Numbers either worked or they did not. Contracts either protected a company or exposed it. But family expectations were never that simple. Around 9:15, Lucas walked into my office without knocking, something he had done since we were kids. He leaned against the doorframe, wearing that same relaxed confidence he carried into every room. "Did you see the investor emails this morning?" he asked. I said yes, without looking away from the spreadsheet on my monitor. They were positive responses to the presentation from the night before. Several investors wanted to schedule follow-up meetings about future development opportunities. Lucas smiled like someone who had just passed an important exam. "Dad thinks we should start exploring West Coast expansion next year," he said. "Los Angeles, maybe San Diego." I nodded and said the financing structures for those markets would require different tax considerations. Lucas shrugged lightly, as if that detail were secondary. "That is why we have analysts," he said. I remember that exact sentence because it was the first time Lucas described my work in that way. Analysts. Not partner. Not brother in the business. Just another category inside the company structure. He left my office after a few minutes and walked down the hall toward my father's corner office. Through the glass wall, I could see them talking, Lucas leaning forward slightly, while my father listened with the expression he reserved for conversations that mattered. That image stayed with me for the rest of the morning. Later that afternoon, my father called me into his office. His office occupied the northeast corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked across Midtown toward the Chrysler Building. The desk alone probably weighed 300 pounds and had been custom-built from dark walnut when the company moved into that tower 15 years earlier. "Sit down, Ethan," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. His voice was calm the way it always was when he had already made up his mind about something. We talked for about 20 minutes. He asked about the Baltimore construction schedule, the status of the Dallas Logistics Park, and whether the lenders for a Chicago redevelopment project had finalized their interest rates. I answered every question with the exact numbers, because that was what I had trained myself to do. Eventually he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "You have always been dependable with the technical side of the company," he said. Dependable. Another one of those polite words that hides its true meaning. Then he continued. "But leadership requires something different. Vision. Presence. The ability to command a room full of investors. Lucas has that instinct." I did not argue. I had learned a long time ago that my father did not change direction once he believed he was correct. Instead, I simply asked whether there would still be space for me in the long-term structure of the company. He paused for a moment before answering, which told me everything I needed to know even before he spoke. "We will always find a role that suits your strengths," he said finally. Role. Not position. Not partner. Just role. When I left his office that afternoon, the hallway outside felt different even though nothing had visibly changed. The company had not fired me yet. My name still appeared on internal documents and email threads. But I could feel the future shifting quietly into place around me, like a construction project where the foundation is poured long before the walls rise high enough for anyone else to notice. What I did not realize then was how soon that invisible shift would become impossible to ignore, and how the envelope sitting unopened in the back of my closet would soon connect my grandfather's quiet warning with the direction my father had already chosen. 2 weeks after that conversation in my father's office, my grandfather called me on a quiet Sunday afternoon. His voice was thinner than I remembered, slower, like every sentence required more effort than it used to. "Ethan, are you free today?" he asked. I told him yes immediately. He lived on the Upper East Side in the same apartment where he had retired after stepping away from Caldwell Holdings nearly a decade earlier. The building overlooked a narrow street lined with old maple trees that turned bright orange every October. When I arrived, the doorman recognized me and nodded toward the elevator like he always did. My grandfather was sitting in his usual armchair near the window when I walked in. A small stack of property blueprints lay on the coffee table in front of him, even though he had officially retired years ago. Some habits never leave people who build companies from nothing. He looked up and smiled when he saw me. "You look tired," he said. I told him work had been busy. That was only half the truth. What I did not say was that the atmosphere at Caldwell Holdings had been shifting in ways that were impossible to ignore. Lucas had started attending meetings that used to involve me directly. My father had begun copying him on email threads that once came only to my inbox. The change was subtle to anyone outside the family, but inside the company the signal was clear. My grandfather listened quietly while I described a few recent projects. He asked detailed questions about financing structures, interest rates, and zoning approvals, the same way he always had when I was younger. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and looked toward the skyline outside his window. When I started Caldwell Holdings in 1968, we operated out of a single office above a hardware store in Newark. One desk, one phone, one filing cabinet. He paused and smiled slightly at the memory. The first property I ever purchased cost $240,000. At the time, it felt like the largest risk anyone could take. I nodded because I had heard parts of this story before, but that afternoon his tone was different. Slower, more deliberate. He continued, "Companies change when they grow. Systems become more complicated. Titles appear. Boards form. Investors arrive. But the most important question never changes." I asked him what question he meant. He turned his eyes back toward me. "Who understands the business and who only understands the spotlight?" The room stayed quiet for a moment after he said that. I realized he had been watching the same pattern inside the family that I had slowly begun to notice myself. He reached down beside his chair and picked up a thick brown envelope. The paper looked old, the edges slightly worn like it had been stored for years. I recognized it immediately even before he handed it to me. It was the same envelope he had given me several years earlier, the one I had placed in the back of my closet without opening. "I never forgot about it," he said calmly, almost as if he could read my thoughts. "I kept a copy here." I asked him again what was inside. This time, he did not avoid the question.
Legal documents, he said.
Very specific legal documents. I sat forward slightly, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hands. He continued speaking before I could ask anything else. "When I stepped down from the company, I did not give up my responsibility for what happens to it. Your father inherited leadership, but inheritance is not the same as understanding." He looked directly at me with the same sharp focus he used to have when he negotiated property deals decades earlier. "You understand the structure of Caldwell Holdings better than anyone else in that building. That is why I prepared those documents." I asked him what they were meant to do. He smiled slightly, but did not answer directly. "They protect the company from decisions made too quickly. Sometimes ambition moves faster than wisdom." I remember holding the envelope for several seconds without speaking. Part of me wanted to open it immediately right there in his living room, but another part of me hesitated because I sensed that whatever was inside would change the way I looked at the company forever. My grandfather seemed to understand that hesitation. "Do not open it yet," he said quietly. "The right moment will come on its own." "How will I know when that moment arrives?" I asked. He gave a small laugh that sounded both tired and confident at the same time. Because the company will suddenly need something that only you can provide. I left his apartment about an hour later with the envelope in my briefcase. As I walked down Park Avenue toward the subway station, I kept replaying his words in my mind. The company will need something that only you can provide. At the time I assumed he meant advice or technical expertise. I did not realize he was describing something far more specific, something hidden inside the legal framework of Caldwell Holdings itself. For the next several months, I continued working exactly the way I always had, reviewing contracts, preparing financial models, solving problems that appeared in development projects across the country. The envelope stayed unopened in my apartment closet. Then came the boardroom meeting on October 3rd, the moment when my father removed me from the company in front of the entire leadership team. And that night, sitting alone in my apartment with the city lights reflecting across the East River, I finally understood what my grandfather meant about the right moment arriving on its own. The night after the boardroom meeting felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a city sounds after midnight when the traffic fades and the only movement comes from distant headlights crossing a bridge. I reached my apartment a little after 8 that evening. For 14 years my routine had been predictable. Dinner, a quick review of emails, and then usually another hour studying project documents before bed. But that night there were no emails waiting for me. My company access had already been disabled before I even left the building. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a few seconds looking around the apartment like I had just arrived in someone else's home. The cardboard box I carried from the office sat on the dining table. Inside were a few notebooks, a framed photograph from the Baltimore groundbreaking ceremony, and a heavy steel pen my grandfather had given me the day I signed my first contract for Caldwell Holdings. 14 years of work reduced to a container smaller than a grocery bag. I poured a glass of water and sat down across from the box, replaying the morning meeting in my head again. My father standing at the head of the table with his hands resting calmly on the polished wood surface. Lucas sitting to his right in a navy suit, leaning back slightly, like he already knew what was about to happen. The board members watching quietly as my father delivered the announcement. Ethan will no longer have any role in the company moving forward. The words had not been loud, but they carried through the room with the finality of a legal verdict. Nobody objected. Nobody even asked a follow-up question. I realized something during that moment that I had never fully understood before. In large companies, silence can be louder than disagreement. Every person in that room understood that my father had already made the decision long before the meeting began. The board was simply witnessing it. I finished the water and stood up, walking toward the bedroom where the closet door was slightly open. For several seconds, I just stared at the shelf in the back where the brown envelope had been sitting untouched for years. The paper looked exactly the same as the day my grandfather gave it to me. Thick, slightly yellowed, sealed along the top edge. I reached for it slowly, feeling the weight of the contents through the paper. My grandfather's words echoed in my mind. The right moment will arrive on its own. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I slid a finger under the seal and opened the envelope for the first time. Inside were several documents printed on heavy legal paper. The first page carried the letterhead of Harper & Langley, the law firm that had represented Caldwell Holdings for decades. Beneath that was a title printed in bold type. Irrevocable Protective Shareholder Provision. I read the first paragraph twice before the meaning settled in. Years earlier, when my grandfather stepped down as chairman, he had restructured a portion of the company's ownership framework. Most of the shares transferred to my father as expected, but a specific class of voting protection had been assigned to a separate legal instrument tied to one individual shareholder. My name appeared on the third page of the document. Ethan Thomas Caldwell. I leaned back slightly, scanning the following pages more carefully. The provision was remarkably specific. Any transaction involving the sale, merger, or equity transfer exceeding 25% of Caldwell Holdings required written approval from the holder of the protective share. Without that approval, the transaction would be considered legally incomplete. The signature line beneath that clause contained only one name.
Mine.
For a moment, the apartment felt completely silent except for the faint hum of traffic outside the window. My father controlled the company. Lucas held an executive title. The board oversaw strategic direction. But buried inside the legal architecture of Caldwell Holdings was a safeguard my grandfather had placed years earlier. And that safeguard depended on a single signature that only I could provide. I placed the documents back on the bed and walked to the window overlooking the river. The city lights reflected across the water like scattered glass. My father believed he had removed me from the company entirely that morning. In practical terms, he had. I no longer had an office, a title, or a salary connected to Caldwell Holdings. But something else remained quietly attached to the structure he was running. I returned to the bed and read the documents again, this time more
slowly.
The language was precise, the kind of careful legal writing that survives courtrooms and negotiations alike. My grandfather had not created a loophole. He had created a break, a mechanism that forced the company to pause whenever decisions grew large enough to reshape its future. And for reasons he never fully explained, he had placed that mechanism in my hands. I placed the papers back into the envelope and sealed it loosely again before setting it on the nightstand. The realization settling in my mind was not anger or revenge. It was something quieter than that.
Clarity.
For the first time since leaving the boardroom that morning, I understood the structure of the situation completely. My father had removed me from the visible side of Caldwell Holdings. But deep inside the legal foundation of the company, my name was still written in ink. The following morning I woke up earlier than usual, even though there was nowhere I needed to be. For 14 years, my schedule had been tied to the rhythm of Caldwell Holdings. Early meetings, project reviews, investor calls, construction updates from different time zones. Suddenly, all of that noise was gone. The apartment felt unusually still when I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker. I sat at the table with the brown envelope beside my laptop and read the documents again in the quiet morning light. The language was precise and deliberate, written in the careful tone lawyers use when they know every word might one day be tested in a courtroom. The protective shareholder provision was not symbolic. It was operational. Without the holder of that protection signing off, any transaction involving a major transfer of company ownership would remain incomplete under the corporate structure my grandfather had designed. I checked the dates printed on the documents. They had been drafted almost 9 years earlier, long before Lucas became an executive, long before the boardroom meeting that ended my role at the company. My grandfather had anticipated something years before it happened. That realization stayed with me as I closed the envelope and placed it back on the table. I did not feel triumphant or angry. Mostly I felt curious. Because if my grandfather believed this safeguard was necessary, he must have expected the company to reach a moment where leadership moved faster than caution. Around mid-morning, I opened my laptop and began scanning public financial reports related to the commercial real estate sector. Old habits do not disappear easily. Even without access to Caldwell Holdings' internal systems, there were still signals available in public filings and market announcements. Investment funds reported property acquisitions. Banks disclosed large financing arrangements. Construction permits appeared in municipal databases weeks before projects were officially announced. Within an hour, a pattern started forming. Several private equity firms had recently raised enormous real estate funds. One of them in particular caught my attention. A New York investment group called Harbor Capital Partners had just closed a $4 billion fund dedicated to acquiring partial ownership in established development companies across the United States. Their strategy was simple: buy significant minority stakes in companies that already controlled large property portfolios, then accelerate expansion using institutional capital. Caldwell Holdings fit that profile perfectly. The company owned commercial assets in 5 major metropolitan areas and had a reputation for completing large-scale developments on schedule. A partnership with a firm like Harbor Capital could push the company into an entirely different level of growth. I leaned back in the chair and considered the timing. My father had removed me from the company less than 24 hours earlier. At the same time, major investment funds were searching for development partners. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like strategy. My father had always believed growth required bold moves. If he saw an opportunity to bring in billions of dollars of outside capital, he would pursue it aggressively. I opened another report and scanned the recent activity of Harbor Capital Partners. Their previous investments typically involved purchasing between 30 and 40% ownership in established companies. That number stopped me for a moment because I remembered the clause written inside my grandfather's documents. Any transaction involving the sale, merger, or equity transfer exceeding 25% required written approval from the prospective shareholder. I closed the report slowly and looked at the envelope again. If Caldwell Holdings entered negotiations with a firm like Harbor Capital and the ownership transfer exceeded that threshold, the entire transaction would legally require my signature. My father probably had no idea that clause existed. The board might not know either. The provision had been buried inside a shareholder protection document that rarely needed to surface unless a major structural change occurred. For years, the company had grown organically through individual development projects rather than large equity partnerships. That meant the protective clause simply remained dormant. But if my father now wanted to sell a significant portion of the company to outside investors, that dormant clause would suddenly become very active. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing market announcements and financial reports, slowly building a clearer picture of the industry environment. Nothing directly connected Caldwell Holdings to Harbor Capital yet, but the strategic logic was undeniable. The company had reached a size where institutional capital could accelerate expansion dramatically. My father had always believed the next phase of growth required bigger financial backing than traditional bank loans could provide. And Lucas, eager to prove himself as the next generation leader, would certainly support an ambitious deal that transformed the company overnight. Late that evening, I closed the laptop and returned the documents to the envelope. I placed it back in the closet, but this time not in the far corner where it had been forgotten for years. Instead, I set it on the front shelf where I could see it easily whenever the door opened. The apartment felt quiet again as the sun disappeared behind the buildings across the river. Somewhere inside the glass tower of Caldwell Holdings, meetings were probably already happening about the company's future. Investors would ask questions. Lawyers would draft agreements. Financial projections would be built on spreadsheets similar to the ones I had created for years. What none of them realized yet was that the structure my grandfather designed had quietly placed a single pause button inside that future. And that pause button still carried my name. The next few weeks passed with a strange rhythm that I had never experienced before. For the first time since I was 22 years old, my schedule did not revolve around Caldwell Holdings. No early board calls, no emergency construction updates, no late-night contract reviews. The silence should have felt relaxing, but instead it felt unfamiliar, like stepping out of a building after years of hearing the same background noise and suddenly realizing how loud it had always been. During the first few days after leaving the company, I kept expecting my phone to vibrate with some crisis from the office. A zoning issue in Dallas. A lender requesting revised projections. A contractor asking for approval on a change order. But nothing came. My email inbox remained quiet because the company account had already been shut down. After a week, I began to rebuild a routine of my own. I woke up early, walked along the river for an hour, and spent the rest of the morning studying the same industry reports I had reviewed for years inside the company. Only now I was reading them without the pressure of immediate deadlines. It allowed me to notice patterns more clearly. One pattern became obvious very quickly. Harbor Capital Partners was moving aggressively through the commercial real estate market. Within 3 weeks, they had announced minority investments in 2 development companies based in Texas and Arizona. Both deals followed the same structure. Harbor Capital acquired 35% ownership in exchange for injecting several $100 million into the companies for future expansion. The announcements were framed as strategic partnerships that allowed the original leadership teams to remain in control while accelerating growth nationwide. I read each press release carefully, studying the financial terms described between the lines. The structure made perfect sense for a company like Caldwell Holdings. My father would retain operational authority while gaining access to a massive pool of capital. Lucas would suddenly be running projects twice as large as anything the company had attempted before. Investors would applaud the ambition. The only complication would be hidden inside the legal framework my grandfather created years earlier. Any ownership transfer beyond 25% required my approval. I closed the article and leaned back in my chair, thinking about the timing again. If Caldwell Holdings began negotiating a deal with Harbor Capital, lawyers and bankers would spend months drafting agreements before anything became public. During that time, my father and Lucas would assume the company's ownership structure worked exactly the way they expected. They would not discover the protective clause until the deal reached its final legal review. That moment could arrive weeks or months later, depending on how quickly negotiations moved. I did not know exactly when it would happen, but I was certain it eventually would. Around the middle of November, I received my first signal that negotiations had probably begun. A former colleague from Caldwell Holdings called me unexpectedly one afternoon. His name was Daniel Harper, one of the corporate attorneys who had worked with the company for years. Our conversations had always been professional rather than personal, but we respected each other because most major contracts eventually passed across both of our desks. His voice sounded slightly cautious when I answered the phone. "Ethan, I hope you are doing well," he said. I told him I was adjusting to the unexpected break from the company. There was a short pause on the line before he continued. "Things have been moving quickly here since you left. The board has been exploring several strategic opportunities." He did not mention Harbor Capital directly, but the way he phrased the sentence told me enough. Strategic opportunities was the kind of language lawyers used when negotiations were underway, but confidentiality agreements prevented them from saying more. I asked him how Lucas was handling the increased responsibility. Daniel gave a small laugh. "He is enthusiastic. Your father seems pleased with the direction things are going." The conversation lasted only a few minutes before he said he needed to return to a meeting. As the call ended, I noticed something interesting about his tone. He sounded curious, almost as if he expected me to react strongly to the news. But I simply thanked him for the update and wished him a good afternoon. After the call ended, I walked to the closet and looked at the brown envelope resting on the front shelf. For years it had been an object of quiet mystery. Now it had become something else entirely. It was a key that had not yet been used. I returned to the living room and opened my laptop again, reviewing more market announcements and property filings across several states. The information slowly confirmed what I had suspected earlier. Caldwell Holdings had filed preliminary paperwork related to 2 large development sites in California, projects far bigger than anything the company had previously attempted without outside funding. Expansion on that scale required enormous capital, exactly the kind Harbor Capital specialized in providing. I closed the laptop and sat quietly for a few minutes, considering the situation. My father believed he had removed me completely from the future of the company. The board likely believed the same thing. Lucas was probably preparing presentations about the next generation of projects he would lead. None of them realized that the legal architecture beneath the company still contained a single point where everything would eventually pause. And when that pause arrived, the person they had pushed out of the boardroom would suddenly become impossible to ignore. By the time December arrived, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every signal in the market pointed toward the same conclusion. Caldwell Holdings was preparing for a structural change far larger than any single development project. Property filings in California had been updated twice within 3 weeks, and the scale of the sites involved suggested plans that would require hundreds of millions of dollars before construction could even begin. The company had never attempted anything of that size without outside capital. At the same time, Harbor Capital Partners continued announcing new minority investments across the country, each one following the same structure I had studied earlier. 30 to 40% ownership in exchange for massive expansion funding. It was the exact kind of partnership my father would pursue if he believed it could accelerate the company's growth by a decade. I started noticing something else during those weeks. News articles about Caldwell Holdings began appearing more frequently in industry publications. The tone of the coverage had shifted. Instead of focusing on individual projects, the articles described the company as a rising national development platform. That phrase appeared several times in different reports, and I recognized it immediately as the kind of language investment firms use when preparing the market for a strategic partnership announcement. The message was subtle but deliberate. Caldwell Holdings was being positioned as a company ready for institutional capital. One evening near the end of December, I met Daniel Harper again for coffee in Midtown. He had sent a short message asking if I wanted to catch up since we had not spoken in person since I left the company. We sat at a small table near the window of a quiet cafe overlooking 6th Avenue. For a few minutes the conversation stayed casual. He asked how I had been spending my time since leaving the company. I told him I had been reading market reports and studying development opportunities across several states. Old habits were difficult to break. Daniel smiled at that. You always were the only person in the building who actually enjoyed reading those reports, he said. After a moment, his expression grew slightly more serious. There has been a lot of activity inside the company lately, he added. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I waited to see what he would say next. Your father has been meeting with several investment groups, he continued. Nothing official yet, but the board has been reviewing some large proposals. I stirred the coffee slowly, keeping my voice neutral. Expansion capital, I asked. Daniel nodded once. Potentially significant expansion capital. He hesitated briefly before adding something else. If a deal happens, it would probably involve transferring a meaningful ownership stake. That phrase again. Meaningful ownership stake. Lawyers rarely used that wording casually. I asked whether Lucas was leading those discussions. Daniel gave a small shrug. Your father is still directing most of the negotiations, but Lucas has been very involved in the presentations. He seems eager to prove himself. The conversation moved on after that, but the important information had already been delivered. When we left the cafe and stepped onto the sidewalk, Daniel shook my hand before heading toward the subway entrance. As I watched him disappear into the crowd, I understood that the timeline I had been anticipating was beginning to accelerate. Negotiations were already happening. Investors were already evaluating the company. Lawyers were already preparing the early framework of an agreement that could reshape the entire ownership structure of Caldwell Holdings. I returned to my apartment that night and opened the closet door again. The brown envelope sat exactly where I had placed it weeks earlier. For a moment, I simply looked at it without touching it. My grandfather had created the clause years before any of this started. At the time, it probably seemed like a distant safeguard that might never become necessary. But now the situation he predicted was beginning to unfold almost exactly as he described. Ambition moving faster than caution. be displayed on large screens. Lawyers would be discussing contract language. Investors would be calculating the value of acquiring a major stake in one of the fastest-growing development companies in the country. And eventually, perhaps weeks or months from now, someone in that room would reach the final stage of the agreement and discover a line of legal text buried inside the company's ownership structure. A line that required one final signature before anything could move forward. When that moment arrived, the person they had removed from the company 6 months earlier would suddenly become part of the conversation again. January arrived with a kind of cold that makes the city feel sharper than usual. The air along the river carried that thin winter wind that pushed people to walk faster with their coats pulled tight around their shoulders. My routine had settled into something steady by then. Mornings were spent reading industry filings, tracking development permits, and watching the subtle signals that moved through the commercial real estate market like quiet currents under the surface. Afternoons usually meant long walks through the city or hours spent reviewing financial structures that interested me personally rather than because someone inside a boardroom expected answers by the next morning. But even with the slower pace, my attention never drifted very far from Caldwell Holdings. Years of understanding the company had trained me to recognize the early signs of major activity, and those signs had begun appearing more frequently. One morning in mid-January, a familiar headline appeared in one of the industry newsletters I followed every day. Would require outside capital, and Harbor Capital had exactly the type of funding that could transform a regional developer into a national platform almost overnight. I closed the reports and leaned back in the chair, remembering something my grandfather once said when explaining how major deals unfold. The public announcement is the final step, he told me years ago. The real decisions happen quietly months earlier. By late January, another signal arrived. A business magazine published a short profile of Lucas, describing him as the rising executive guiding Caldwell Holdings into its next phase of growth. The article quoted him discussing strategic partnerships and national expansion, phrases that sounded remarkably similar to the messaging Harbor Capital used when introducing new investments. I recognized the tone immediately. The market was being prepared for something larger than a single development project. Several days later, I received another call from Daniel Harper. His voice sounded more cautious than the previous time we spoke. "Ethan," he said, "I thought you might want to hear something before it becomes public." I asked him what was happening. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "The board has reached preliminary agreement with an investment partner. The deal is still being finalized, but the ownership transfer is expected to be around 40%. 40%. The number landed exactly where I expected it would. Well beyond the 25% threshold written inside my grandfather's protective clause. Daniel continued speaking. "The legal teams are reviewing the final structure now. If everything moves forward, the announcement could happen within a few weeks." I thanked him for the update and ended the call after a few minutes. When the line went quiet, I sat there for a moment without moving. Months earlier, I had only suspected that negotiations might be happening. Now the confirmation had arrived. Caldwell Holdings was preparing to transfer nearly half of its ownership to outside investors. From a purely strategic perspective, the deal probably made sense. The capital injection would allow the company to pursue development projects that previously required years of incremental growth. Investors would likely view it as a bold step forward. But there was one detail my father and the board had not accounted for. The legal framework of the company had not changed since my grandfather designed it. That meant the protective clause was still active. Any ownership transfer above 25% required approval from the holder of that provision. My approval. I walked to the closet and took the brown envelope from the shelf again. The documents inside looked exactly the same as they had the night I first opened them. Heavy legal paper, carefully structured language, and the single line that carried my name as the protective shareholder. I read through the pages slowly, even though I already knew every sentence. Outside the apartment window, the winter sky was beginning to darken as evening approached. Traffic lights reflected against the wet pavement below, while people hurried along the sidewalks trying to escape the cold. Somewhere across the city, inside the conference rooms of Caldwell Holdings, lawyers and bankers were likely preparing the final version of the partnership agreement. Financial projections would be presented, equity percentages calculated, and closing timelines discussed. Eventually, someone would reach the section of the ownership structure that required final verification. When that moment came, they would discover something none of them expected. The company they believed was fully under their control still contained a safeguard placed there years earlier by the man who built it from the ground up. And that safeguard depended entirely on the signature of the one person they had pushed out of the building 6 months before. The final stage of a major deal does not look dramatic from the outside. There are no flashing lights or loud announcements. It usually happens inside quiet conference rooms where lawyers review documents line by line while financial analysts confirm that every number matches the agreements negotiated over months of discussions. By early February, that process was already underway inside the offices of Caldwell Holdings. I knew that because several industry reporters began hinting that a major development partnership announcement was expected soon. The language in those articles was cautious, but consistent. A large institutional investor was preparing to acquire a substantial minority stake in one of the fastest-growing real estate developers in the northeastern United States. Anyone familiar with the market would recognize the company being described. One afternoon, I received another message from Daniel Harper asking if we could speak briefly. When I answered the call, his voice carried a tension that had not been present in our earlier conversations. "Ethan, something unexpected came up during the final legal review," he said. I did not interrupt him. Instead, I waited quietly, already sensing what he was about to say. "The investment agreement has been finalized between Caldwell Holdings and Harbor Capital Partners," he continued. "The equity transfer is set at 40% ownership. The board approved the structure last week, and the closing documents are scheduled for completion within the next few days." He paused for a moment before continuing. "During the final verification of the corporate ownership framework, our legal team discovered a provision tied to a protective shareholder authorization." I could almost picture the moment he was describing. A conference room table covered in contracts. Attorneys scanning the company structure to confirm that every signature requirement had been satisfied. Someone reading the clause my grandfather created nearly a decade earlier. And then the sudden realization that the transaction could not proceed without one more approval. Daniel spoke again. "According to the documents filed years ago, the protective authorization belongs to you." The room where I was sitting remained completely quiet as he said the words. I asked him what the board's reaction had been when the clause appeared during the review. He let out a slow breath before answering. "They were surprised. Your father had not realized that provision still existed. Neither had Lucas." The lawyers traced the documentation back through the original filings and confirmed that it is legally binding. "Without your written approval, the transaction cannot be finalized." I stood up and walked toward the window while he spoke, looking down at the evening traffic moving slowly along the avenue below. After several seconds, I asked him the question that mattered most. "What happens now?" Daniel answered carefully. "The closing date for the agreement is scheduled for next week. Harbor Capital has already committed the capital, and the board has approved the partnership. At this stage, the only missing element is the required authorization from the protective shareholder. In other words," he added quietly, "your signature." The line went silent again for a moment. I thanked him for explaining the situation and told him I would review the documents myself before making any decisions. He said he understood and ended the call. After the phone screen went dark, I remained standing near the window for several minutes. Across the city, Somewhere inside the tall glass tower where I had spent 14 years building financial models and solving development problems, the leadership team of Caldwell Holdings was now facing a complication they had never anticipated. The deal they believed would launch the company into a new era could not move forward without involving the one person they had removed from the company 6 months earlier. I walked back to the closet and took the brown envelope from the shelf once more. The protective shareholder document rested exactly where it had been each time I opened it before. The language remained simple and precise. Any ownership transfer exceeding the specified threshold required written approval from the designated shareholder. The designated shareholder was Ethan Thomas Caldwell. I closed the envelope again and placed it on the table beside the window. The evening sky over the river had grown dark, and the reflection of city lights stretched across the water like long strands of gold. Somewhere across Manhattan, my father was likely reviewing the same situation with his attorneys and financial advisors. For decades, he had controlled every major decision inside Caldwell Holdings with absolute authority. Now, a single clause placed into the company structure by my grandfather years earlier had introduced a variable he could not ignore. The deal that promised billions of dollars in new capital and nationwide expansion now paused at one simple requirement: a signature that only one person could provide. The call from my father came 2 days after Daniel explained what had happened during the legal review. I knew it was him the moment the phone vibrated on the table. His name appeared on the screen exactly the way it had thousands of times before during my years at Caldwell Holdings, but this time the circumstances were very different. For a moment, I simply looked at the screen without answering. The last time we had spoken directly was the morning he removed me from the company in front of the board. Eventually, the ringing stopped, and the screen went dark. 30 seconds later, it lit up again with the same name. This time I answered. His voice sounded steady, but there was something beneath the surface that I had never heard before. Not anger, not authority, but something closer to careful restraint.
"Ethan," he said, "it has been a while."
I replied calmly that it had been about 6 months. There was a short pause on the line before he continued. "I assume you have already heard about the situation involving the investment agreement."
I
said that Daniel had mentioned the legal review. Another pause followed, longer this time. "Your grandfather created a provision that neither the board nor I were fully aware of," he said. "Apparently, the agreement requires your written approval before the transaction can close." I walked toward the window while he spoke, watching the evening traffic moving slowly through the city streets below. "Yes," I said. "I have read the documents." He cleared his throat slightly before continuing. "Harbor Capital Partners is committing nearly $1.8 billion in expansion capital. The partnership will allow Caldwell Holdings to move into markets that would otherwise take years to reach. It is an important step for the company." His voice carried the familiar tone of a chief executive explaining strategy to an investor. The difference was that this time the explanation was directed at me. I listened quietly for a moment before responding. "It sounds like a very ambitious deal." He did not reply immediately. Instead, he asked a question that felt almost unusual coming from him. "When can we meet to discuss this?" For most of my life, conversations with my father followed a clear hierarchy. He spoke and others responded. This was the first time I could remember him asking when it would be convenient for me. I told him I was available the following afternoon. He suggested meeting at the company headquarters. I considered that for a moment before answering. If we were going to discuss a legal authorization, it might make more sense to meet with the attorneys present. There was another brief silence before he agreed. The meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock the next day in the same conference room where the board had approved the partnership agreement. After the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and looked around the apartment. 6 months earlier, I had walked out of Caldwell Holdings carrying a small cardboard box that contained the last pieces of my office. Now the company that had removed me from its structure was requesting my involvement in the most significant transaction it had ever attempted. The following afternoon, the city sky was clear and cold as I stepped out of the car in front of the glass tower, where Caldwell Holdings occupied the upper floors. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Employees moved through the lobby, carrying briefcases and laptops, while security guards watched the entrance quietly from behind the reception desk. When I walked inside, a few people recognized me immediately. Their expressions showed the same mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. My security badge had been deactivated months earlier, so the receptionist contacted the legal department to escort me upstairs. Daniel Harper arrived a few minutes later and shook my hand as if nothing unusual had happened. We took the elevator to the 42nd floor in silence. When the doors opened, the hallway looked identical to the day I left. The same polished floors, the same framed photographs of development projects along the walls, the same glass conference rooms where negotiations had shaped the company for years. The large boardroom door was already open when we approached it. Inside the room, several people were seated around the long table reviewing documents. My father sat at the head of the table. Lucas was on his right side, leaning slightly forward with a stack of papers in front of him. Representatives from Harbor Capital sat across from them, along with two attorneys from the firm handling the transaction. When I entered the room, the conversation stopped immediately. For a moment, nobody spoke. The atmosphere felt almost identical to the morning 6 months earlier when my father announced that I would no longer have a role in the company. The difference was that this time every person in the room understood that the situation had changed. Daniel placed a folder in front of the empty chair near the center of the table and gestured for me to sit. My father looked at me carefully before speaking. "Thank you for coming, Ethan," he said. "We need to discuss the authorization required to finalize the agreement." I opened the folder slowly and saw the final partnership documents arranged neatly inside. At the very end of the stack was a single page carrying the line that had stopped the entire transaction. "Protective shareholder approval required before closing." Beneath that sentence was a blank space waiting for a signature. My signature. The room stayed quiet after I opened the folder. The final agreement between Caldwell Holdings and Harbor Capital Partners was neatly organized across several sections, each one outlining the financial structure, governance framework, and expansion strategy that would guide the company's next decade. I recognized the structure immediately. The deal had been built carefully. 40% equity in exchange for $1.8 billion in expansion capital. Harbor Capital would gain board representation while my father would retain operational control of the company. On paper, it was exactly the kind of partnership that could transform Caldwell Holdings from a regional developer into a national powerhouse almost overnight. I slowly turned the last page and rested my hand on the table for a moment. The single line near the bottom of the document was simple and direct. Protective shareholder authorization required prior to closing. Beneath it was the empty space reserved for my signature. Around the table, everyone was watching me carefully. Lucas leaned forward slightly with both hands resting on the papers in front of him. The representatives from Harbor Capital remained quiet but attentive, their expressions neutral in the practiced way professional investors maintain during negotiations. My father sat at the head of the table exactly where he had been sitting 6 months earlier when he removed me from the company. The difference now was that the authority in the room no longer moved in only one direction. My father finally spoke. "The structure of this agreement positions Caldwell Holdings for long-term growth," he said. "The capital will allow us to move into California and several other markets immediately. The board has already approved the partnership unanimously." His tone sounded controlled, almost formal, as if he were presenting the strategy during a quarterly meeting. I looked back at the documents before answering. "The structure is clear," I said. "The financing model is strong. Harbor Capital gains a significant stake while the company maintains operational continuity." One of the investors nodded slightly across the table. For a moment, the conversation felt almost like the dozens of meetings I had attended during my years at Caldwell Holdings. Then Lucas spoke for the first time. "We are ready to move forward as soon as the authorization is completed," he said. His voice carried the same confidence I had heard in countless presentations over the years. I glanced at him briefly before returning my attention to the final page of the agreement. When I spoke again, my voice remained calm. "Before anything moves forward, there is something we should clarify about the structure of the company." Several people around the table shifted slightly in their chairs. I continued speaking without raising my voice. The protective shareholder clause was not created to stop growth. It was created to protect the company from decisions that move faster than understanding. My grandfather designed it for moments exactly like this one. My father listened without interrupting. I could see the same analytical focus in his eyes that he used during difficult negotiations. After a few seconds, he responded. "And what is your conclusion about the decision in front of us?" he asked. I looked around the table once more before answering. "The partnership itself is not the problem. The company will benefit from expansion capital. But the structure of leadership inside Caldwell Holdings cannot ignore the people who built its foundation." For several seconds, no one spoke. Then I closed the folder slowly and placed the pen on the document. When I finally signed my name, the motion felt almost quiet, just a small movement of ink across paper. But the effect in the room was immediate. Daniel collected the page and passed it to the legal team representing Harbor Capital. One of the attorneys reviewed the document quickly before nodding toward the investors. The final authorization had been completed. My father leaned back slightly in his chair as the tension in the room eased for the first time since the meeting began. For a moment, our eyes met across the table. There was no anger in his expression now, only something closer to recognition. The company had reached the next stage of its history, but the path there had forced him to acknowledge something that had been ignored for years. Caldwell Holdings had been built on more than one kind of strength. Lucas began discussing the timeline for the public announcement with the investors while the attorneys organized the completed documents into their folders. I stood up quietly from the table as the conversation shifted toward logistics. The boardroom looked exactly the same as it had the day I walked out 6 months earlier. The same long glass windows overlooking the city and the same polished table where so many decisions had been made. The difference now was not the room or the people inside it. The difference was the understanding that power inside a company is not only about titles or offices. Sometimes it is hidden inside the structure itself, waiting patiently until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore.